Excellente. So I had never met the gentleman. I heard about him through reputation when I first started out of school. A guy was working with had worked with him at Anaconda, and Ed McAllister was a mining engineer. But critical to the story was that during World War II, he was a Navy SEAL, and the U.S. Navy, for reasons that only they know and probably nobody's there left that remembers, were concerned about an invasion of Japan at the end of World War II. They felt that the US would lose hundreds of thousands of people
Yeah.
going up the shore. And they built a sensor, a geophysical sensor, to basically detect mines along the foreshore. And they used the IP phenomena to basically run that sensor. And this was in like 1943, 1944. And thank goodness that did not have to happen. That technology was never used for that purpose. But that's where he got exposed to IP. One of the interesting things is that happened in 1943, but it was Conrad Schlumberger who actually first observed IP. Date in the Siegel et al. Paper in '07 and Leading Edge suggests 1913, more or less. But there was a lot of work done subsequently. A lot of it focused in Russia, and a lot of it focused in the petroleum industry using IP. Not so much on the mineral side. But amazingly, when the program started with the US Navy, they weren't aware of what Schlumberger had done. And so I used the word silo earlier. And I thought, wow, that's got to be one of the first silos in the mining geophysics. Is that this guy in Europe and he published. Maybe these guys couldn't read. I don't know. But anyways, the SEALs were sworn to secrecy. So after the war, they weren't supposed to talk about any of the experiences and the technology. But the US government is never a consistent story, right? The US government wanted to give US industry the opportunity to exploit all the technologies that had been secret during the war and put them out into the general, industry complex. And Newmont heard about this in about 1946, and they approached Arthur Brandt. So we have a Newmont component to the IP story. They went in and basically hired a company who got all the files on IP, even though they were still technically secret. And Ed McAllister had his lips sealed, didn't tell anybody until one of the other guys he was a SEAL with went back east to university and took a degree in IP. And he was giving papers at the SEG and the rest of it in the late 40s and early 50s. So this is the contraption that is shown from and Beale is one of his Navy SEAL compadres, and so he took the ideas on the left from the Navy and started building equipment that basically allowed him to go out and do IP surveys. This is 1948, being applied to minerals exploration. So this is one of technically the very first IP surveys. Hey, they've even got the drill holes plotted. I mean, I've seen stuff that looks like this that's been generated a year ago. Maybe it's colored, but it's still basically the same idea. You have survey lines, you have anomalies that are contoured, even the units, millivolt per volt. I'm familiar with that. So they were very much on top of it. But anyways, McAllister then got a job with the company Anaconda, and he was told, we want two things. We're looking for copper. We want to see deep, and we want to try and separate pyrite from chalcopyrite. Those are the two factors that he was assigned. We don't have a pithy little strategic plan out of Newmont. They were more scientists, whereas McAllister was a mining engineer. So it's like, let's get the job done. Let's do it now and get on with it. Whereas Brent brought all these clever people into Jerome and they started tinkering with all sorts of things, airborne, ground, IP, EM, theoretical models. Anaconda did not spend a lot of time worrying about that. Their success was how many amps can we get in the ground and how far can we see in these basin and range terrains where we're going looking for porphyry coppers. So they were more pragmatic, not really scientists in the same, quite the same way. So, it was an interesting, I don't even know if they were frenemies. I have no idea whether they even had heavy conversations with each other, but there was a race between those two companies. It certainly was very active in the 1950s. What happened though was I term it, and it still has, I have to think about it a bit more. Grant himself got bored. Being a really smart guy, he'd done the IP story for a decade. Jim Waite, who was also a genius on EM, wrote the book, 1959, Over Voltage Research. It's a wonderful read. It's available as a PDF if you haven't seen it, or you can still get physical books. Anaconda provided almost no information. They were like the damn CIA. If you talk to one of their guys in a bar in Pioche, Nevada, you might get something out of them. But otherwise, they did not go and do papers, certainly in the 50s. And some wonderful stuff. This is war surplus. And they were getting 50 kilowatt transmitters out there before the end of the 40s. They were starting to survey known deposits to see what they could get out of it because there wasn't any reference. Had to start somewhere. This is one from the late 40s over San Manuel in Arizona. And if you look at the legend, you see things like depth contour. These guys were modeling their data in Z. At the very first, they were conscious. We needed to know where it's coming from in depth. They weren't just mucking around. Let's go get some data and we got some numbers. They were out there solving problems. They were really, I thought, very, very shrewd. This deposit was both a wonderful thing to see and in a way a disappointment. This is a one in Peru that Newmont did one of their very first surveys, probably one of the first outside of the US. And what you see are the pyrite halos around the central core. This took 20 years for the geologists to come up with the Lowell and Gilbert model that explained that from a geological perspective, an alteration and distribution of sulfides. The geophysicists had it a generation before. They had that information, but they didn't know what to do with it. To me, it's like building the Hubble telescope and giving it to a blind person. You have great power, but you don't know what to do with it. And there's no discussion, even though they had smart guys. They had no discussion about what they were thinking at the time in terms of, is there an alteration signature? But they went over, and this is sort of inference. They and other companies jumped into the fray as more general IP equipment became available in the 60s. And they actually knew, probably by at least the mid 60s, what was going on in terms of alteration signatures, what you should be looking for. Nobody wrote it up until Stan Ward held a symposium in 1967 at Berkeley. Very first one on IP. And he got Anaconda and Newmont to come to the table, talk about what they were doing. It wouldn't have happened if Stan had not used his influence to basically convince them. The geophysicists and the companies were also, as we call it, tight butt. they didn't want to release anything. I mean, Newmont put something out at the end of the 50s, but that was at a point where I think Arthur thought that they had tapped into all they were going to likely get, because what they turned to was EM. That became the big thing for them. IP was until Perry Eaton picked it up again back in 1995 or so, when they started their own Newmont system. Newmont was doing very little on IP. I had lots of experiments. Anaconda's approach was, you have to get out there and actually do real work and drill holes. Don't let the scientists run your facilities, right? You needed to get, Anaconda had 6 of these systems. They called the transmitter Big Bertha. 6 of these systems, 50 kilowatt systems that they were taking around. So that was industrial scale work, as far as I could see. Porphyries weren't the only thing that benefited from seeing IP surveys done. The biggest one that is sort of publicly talked about, maybe because porphyries in BC weren't as exciting, although they were finding them in the 50s, was the Pine Point lead zinc discoveries. And that really established companies like Huntech, Syntrex, McFar. Everybody who went up there did something clever. And because of the nature of the geology, these things were pretty good. So in the mid-60s, there was a surge of work in the Pine Point area, and then other sorts of things. Some cases VMS, some cases epithermal gold, other types of mineral systems, magmatic nickel. IP was used for a lot of things, but there's only a few that it really shone in terms of this is a sort of a collage of.
Is that last page out of Telford's book?
No, I don't. No, it's not. It's I think it was an SCG paper on, I think, that Harry put together. And gravity was also one of the tools there. So here's a very young Dave Fountain. I mean, he collected data in the 60s and 70s, but he actually had some case histories of work. I think like a Copper Mountain. I think Newmont was doing IP there in the late 50s. And they're still, I haven't heard much what's happening now that Hudbay owns it, but and the banner, the McFar banner, is very prominent because they were one of the few service companies that actually made a big effort to put case histories out there. And thanks to people like Phil Halloff, Dave Fountain, Bill Pelton was one of their chosen ones. He also got his PhD under Stan Ward. Not the most pleasant person in the world, but a very competent geophysicist. The record, this is a smattering of what's come out, the original Jim Waite book in 59. John Sumner did a book which was more of a field manual. It sort of described all the arrays and stuff like that. And that was helpful, but it gave you more information on the mechanics of doing IP. And then Stan Ward, I think I was thinking about this recently because I had some discussions with people and where information about what had been going on surfaced. And there was an opportunity with the Decennial Conference in 1987 to capture work that Zong had been doing, Phoenix had been doing, Stan had been doing at Berkeley. And when I discussed it with the person who was the technical chair, and I have enormous respect for them, it was like, why do we want to talk about IP? EM's the only thing. So there's another silo. But I said, you got to get something on IP. And they got the one paper was Mark Halverson's on the work that Anaconda had been doing on noise rejection, remote reference, something. So snapshot of their technology appeared in that 87 paper. Stan, I think, was really pissed. And so being editor of the SEG publications, got this book together because basically it captured most of the technology at the time that had been developed over the, since the early 70s, including Zong's stuff. Zong gave papers, but he never really got much traction with the community, particularly outside of the US. The guys in the US loved him, but up here, I know Peter Kowalchuk took a system out, ran it over in DACO and stuff like that, but it never really caught on. And even the frequency domain stuff that McFar was doing. So important to realize that there was knowledge out there, but it was spotty. Some companies started to, like Kennecott, do their own work. They did some great petrophysics, which Newmont was doing, but they didn't release that much. They did some in the 1967 companion volumes, or 66, the green books that the SEG produced. McFar worked hard, and they certainly relied on spectral IP approaches. That what Kennecott did was pass over intellectual property and use of equipment to the University of Utah, to Stan and his students to work with. As that whole organization was declining, they were sort of thrown overboard, and Stan was there with open arms to get all this. And because you don't see anything like that up in Canada. Those American companies probably didn't even want to cross the 49th parallel. It just did not take. So they did other stuff. It's not that they didn't do things, but the IP story is dominantly a US-based one. That was the symposium that Stan put together, and I've just annotated this. N is Newmont, and A is Anaconda. How Stan was successful in getting these companies to open up and actually tell the world and their peers what they were doing. If this workshop hadn't been done, they weren't presenting papers at the SEG. You had to have a forum where there was a quid pro quo, I think. As SEG, you could be the only person in the room saying anything. So everybody else listens to you, and they don't contribute squat. But a symposium, everybody has to contribute. It's a more equal footing for exchange of information. So Newmont, of course, had a longer history and were more boastful, but you can see that Mark Halverson's name was appearing 67, and he continued to do exceptional things for that company. There was another one in 77. Stan was involved with this, but the meetings migrated to Tucson, which was a good place for IP to be considered. And here again, you can see the Z is the papers that Ken Zong was contributing quite a bit, and the hyphenated one is just what I came up with to describe. It was the Kennecott University of Utah interaction, because it was obvious that the technology that Kennecott had spent millions developing, it was a fire sale. And I've talked, Bill Pelton, of course, passed a number of years ago, but a colleague of his who was also doing PhD, Jim Klein, outlined it reasonably clearly as what was going on. Newmont still had a few, but they were declining. But notice really nothing from Anaconda. They had gone quiet. Well, part of the reason they went quiet was Arco took them over, oil company. So they converted them from a mining-focused to a petroleum-focused research group. And they were kind of the wellspring of what became the use of electrical techniques for petroleum. And there was a surge starting in the 70s, going through till about 84 when oil prices tanked. So you have to have somebody with money, and you have to have somebody with ideas, and you have to have somebody with equipment. And there was a confluence of all of that in the US at the time. And I was staring at this image, and I thought, well, big old gnarly, Ford 350, what the heck? But you look at the other two and I think that's what a seismic dog box looks like. And that's what the model was for Anaconda. They basically went to the multi-electrode, multi-array approach. And I actually saw one of these systems at Yarrington, 1976, and they were clean as a whistle. And nine track tapes and the rest of it. How many of you were working in that sort of environment, back then? It just this was like NASA. They really put money into it and wanted to see what they could get out of it. I was carrying an IPR7 around in places that goats wouldn't go. Kennicott's program was impressive, but like a lot of things, it didn't go on forever. But they looked at basically instrumentation, borehole excitation, physical property lab tests. I mean, there was a renaissance period in the US and with IP in that period of the 70s and early 80s that it was good, I think, that it's expanded beyond what Anaconda and Newmont were doing, because you got definitely some different thinking in there. One of the things, and some of you may have seen it, Kennecott went around to a number of their pits in Arizona and took, I think it was like 10-meter spaced A spacings, and ran through measuring chargeability and resistivity on like 10 deposits. And then they put them all together and looked at resistivities, chargeabilities, who's doing what to whom, what can we expect? We never did that. I did one like that with the Zong system at Island Copper, but they never made use of any of that. Whereas these guys were working at an industry scale that was very, very impressive. But still, Anaconda was very quiet. In the late 70s, forward modeling was becoming better and better. One of the things that Pelton was able to secure from Kennecott was the first inversion code for IP. And I actually got a program from the University of Utah, and we ran it. And what they did was they did like 1,000 forward models, dikes. And then they had a lookup table, because they actually couldn't run the inversion fast enough, but they could do the lookup table. And it gave really good results. But then it never really, I don't know that I ever saw anybody using Pelton / Chevron's or Kennecott's approach to IP inversion. It was one of those things where there literally weren't enough people left after the oil companies canned all the mining groups to do anything. You'd have guys like Frank Fritz up in the caves of Colorado, and the individuals didn't have the resources to carry that technology. You needed an actual larger organization, which just didn't, in the US, just didn't exist. Forward modeling, a lot of work on spectral IP. That was one of Ed McAllister's missions, and others jumped into that, trying to understand grain size distributions and such. And there's still people out there. Kristen Inn was telling me that Pierre Burbet's son is a professor at a university in Montreal, and he apparently has done something quite clever with 2 million IP decays. And he thinks there's something predictable that can come out of it. I've never heard of this until, yeah, time for music. Oh, yeah, and Zong, I mean, he struck out there and kept going and was abused. Literally, I was there at one of the talks that he gave at the SCG in 1977, and Bill Pelton jumped up and just was very impolite about the whole process, because he had his way of doing spectral IP, whereas Zong had his own way. IPR11 came out, 6-channel, pretty amazing stuff. It was actually doing coal modeling in the box. our first run at it with the Zong system was we got a HP 9845, and 1981, it cost $45,000, which is probably $500,000. So it would be the cost of a mini computer. Next one, 1981, again in Arizona. Newmont pops up again. We see Zong's got a couple, but Anaconda's still there. We started to get more sophisticated with modeling, all generated a priori on computers, but 3-layer curves. So I spent a lot of time with tissue paper and things like that. They were generally available. They were a couple of $1,000 to buy this set, but it wasn't bad. The critical meeting at the end of this series, at the end of the millennium, was this memorial meeting for John Sumner in '94. And this is where components, it's hard to read. It's not critical, but they basically spent 3 days. There were over 170 people there. Half of them were from the States. There's not that many US geophysicists anymore, but half of them were from the US, government, industry, academia. And John Kingman presented ideas, and he had been with the Anaconda group for the previous about 15 years. And he had learned from Halverson, he had learned from McAllister, and he was basically bushwhacked by 2 people who said, I got to have that guy working for me. One was Nick Sheard at MIM. Nick's still around, very dynamic individual, sort of Napoleon type character. And the other was Keith Morrison, Quantec. And they wanted to work very desperately with Kingman to develop the way to acquire and process IP data. Nick won out and got him for about 4 years. At the end of that, in about 97, he started working for Quantec. That became Titan, which became Orion. So the array system, which starts off with Ed McAllister, the Anaconda DNA. McAllister led to Halverson, led to Kingman. And so the technology that was discussed in 2014 at the last major IP conference that was presented by all the various contractors, some of them are in this room today, largely had its origins around what you could see Anaconda had been doing. They've got variations of the theme, but they definitely, when I call it a thin line, this wasn't a herd. This wasn't an institution. This was a few people with ideas working together closely in one company for decades. And they finally got the end of the light of the day. Doesn't take anything away from what other people have done. Like, Greg Shore with eScan, he was actually ahead of the curve in many respects, but he never got it quite commercially robust enough to grow the company. Zong had his own ideas, and they're still there. They're still manufacturing equipment, but it remains a niche largely in terms of it's a bit like UTEM. I always found that it was difficult to find people that were really good at UTEM, except people that worked at Cominco and ANCO, and everybody else was like, no pass-up, don't understand it. And with BHP, we had to use things that were robust and, we could drop into Indonesia or South Africa or Brazil. Didn't require 2 years worth of training to get a result. So we had to have armaments that were relatively simple, bolt action. So in 1994, the last big meeting, 2014 really wasn't a technical meeting in the sense that it was contractors talking about what they'd done. So they presented results. DS, Newmont, Kingman was there talking about the work they had been doing at Newmont. Stan Ward had put his last kick at the cat, summarized it with a couple of other actually students of his, came out in a 1995 leading edge article. And but the really critical stuff was the work that 175 people, 18 countries. These are the issues that they were looking at, questions they were asking. How do we get better in this, that, and the other? Probably the work that MIM and Quantech did were probably the two most significant outcomes in terms of commercial uptake of those ideas. I'm sure there was some other ideas on the table that just didn't have a champion. You weren't able to get the thing down. One of the things Stan made sure to include was talking about environmental applications. That was recognized back in the mid-90s that there was a real, and that's where people like Jim Fink, who used to be a very strong mining geophysicist with ESO, he went into that, water management, things like that. So they weren't just focused on traditional minerals applications, they were broadening the range of things you're going after. Modeling, this was right in the midst of Doug Oldenburg's big push in the 90s, got 2D, 3D, electrical, started off in the late 80s, but he got significant support from the mining community starting in 1991. Yeah, environmental applications, that became more and more important. Temporal monitoring, that was one thing Jim Fink really focused on for his hydrology stuff. But these individuals is sort of like the same names keep popping up. Not that many papers. The important papers, the ones that are really breaking ground, these people were there involved. It's like those scenarios where they think there's aliens amongst us, and you look for behaviors that are different and unexpected, and these people were doing just that. These folks were definitely frenemies. Quantech had been doing a lot of work for MIM in South America, so they had a relationship. Quantech, Keith really, really wanted to participate with the MIM project, but the MIM board wasn't having any part of it. Even though Nick thought it would be a good idea, he was overruled by his boss, Ross Varden, and the board of directors of MIM. And then, of course, a few years later, they got taken out by Xstrata, Glencore, and the whole thing was moot, and the technology migrated over to Terry Ritchie, who now runs it as MIMDAS and has done successfully for 20 years. Quantech went through a tough time because they were poised to do a public offering, and it got totally ballsed up in the late 90s with the BRIACs. And Barrick and Noranda putting money in, which kind of got stalled, and the whole thing almost derailed the company. But they were able to pull it together and continue on with it, and use technology that they saw was similar to MIM's, but actually technically seemed to be better, which of course bothered Nick enormously, being Nick. Outcomes, adding the MT acquisition, the array style, the 3D, all was sort of talked about in that era 20 years ago, although people like Greg Shore were doing something similar. So yeah, that's Nick is the one in the picture on the left, and on the left side of that image. So Quantech Orion, first full survey that was done well was 2011. We actually had a chance to work on that data. It was on a project in Nevada. NUDAS was there, but of course, Newmont shut down their entire geophysical R&D activity a couple of years ago. The systems we now have were introduced in 2014. Not quite sure what to say about typhoon. I'm not sure if I even spelled it right. I think I spelled it right. Anyways, I understand they use part of some commercial equipment, so it's really a hybrid. It's not a total 100% homegrown. Whoever is in charge of that. So the two histories, Glenn Collette did one that was in the 1990 SEG book on IP. It's good, as is Harry Siegel et al.'s in 2007. But they missed the Anaconda story because there was nothing to read. It was in the workshops, but unless you went back, just looked at that body of knowledge, you couldn't really see what they were doing. So they mentioned Ed McAllister and they mentioned Halverson, but they really didn't understand what had been done. And that's where I think when I started looking at McAllister's career, my breakthrough was the family. We approached them, Kingman and I. He's got like 4 or 5 kids. Said, he got anything? Did your father write anything about his career? Turns out he wrote a stack. It's My Life 1, 2, 3, and 4. And when I read that, I had to say, this is what this guy was doing. This is what he was thinking. He documented it all 50 years before when he wrote these, about 5 years before he died. And I could see that they were doing something really, really exceptional. But he never put it in a SEG paper, what have you. I mean, he's co-author for tons of stuff, but he was the godfather, basically. It was people like Kingman and Halverson and others that did the heavy lifting technically, which was fine with him. So yeah, I was quite surprised, actually. Doug's great stuff. We haven't advanced much since he worked on that 20 years ago, and that's a question which I think is relevant to the community now, is where do we go? What are the next range of problems that we should be looking at? One of the things that Nick did, that was a paper he presented in the ASCG, why he put time and effort into it. It's usually we want to see deeper and we want to see more clearly what's going on. This is kind of just a bar graph of all the various groups that I could tag as to what they've been doing and when were they still in existence. So a lot of time and effort, maybe more than any other geophysical technique, has gone into IP, I would say, and money and people effort. Do we have a lot to show for it? Well, that's another interesting question that if I have the time, close this one off, which I call the technology development, and look at outcomes, what actually was achieved in this period. I can see some things that weren't achieved, but it's difficult to find these stories. Rob Gordon speaks of one at the Chemist deposit up in north central BC. In 2006, they did a Titan survey, which was used by the client to drill a hole, which found a deep 750-meter deep deposit. A press release was put on it. When the team from the company got their GDAC award, not a mention was made of the IP survey. And Rob went to the guy and he said, what happened? And he says, oh, you just found pyrite. And Rob says, if you hadn't drilled the pyrite anomaly, you wouldn't have found the ore body. Don't you think there's something missing in your logic? Anyways, in the last CIM publication on porphyries, came out in 2020, there's a tabulation of many of the BC systems. And in it, it says Chemist North, found with IP. So they got it right. I told Rob that too, that he may have to go to his grave, but at least he's recognized as contributing. And that's part of the problem of trying to get accurate information as to what geophysics has often done. We're not dealing with an unbiased audience in terms of who gets to tell the stories most of the time. It's not the geophysicists. Or if we do, it's amongst each other and nobody cares. because it doesn't impact on the overall exploration community. You need to hear it from real people, the geologists, otherwise it's tough.
Right.
Who's Gap?
Gap.
Just above him.
Yeah, under St. Joe. Oh, I have to go back and check my notes, Dennis.
You don't mean Gap Geophysics?
I don't think
Really?
so. They're not doing,
They weren't.
no. I'll track that one down. I that stood out this morning when I was looking at it. The, that other one there. Oh, yeah, I have to, the people that contributed to this story. But there's the major groups, MIM, GRS, Anaconda. Newmont sort of sputtered and then quit. So came and gave a nice talk at the 2014 meeting. The plan is with the roundup is to have a half-day session with the this is the MDRU and DMEC. A half-day session as part of it to look at where the technology is and where the community thinks it should go. It's not as full-blown as, like, say, the 1994 meeting, because we just don't have the people. We no longer have academics who are sitting there waiting for questions to be asked of them about IP. They've moved onto other stuff. So, and we don't have the companies with large bankrolls who think going looking for porphyries. I mean, just look what BHP did recently. They got into one of the best porphyry coppers by just sidling up to Lundin and saying, hey guys, we got some money, you got a deposit, let's go. That's the way they make their new deposits. It's fine, let somebody else do the hard work. They'd like to claim they're looking, but track record is not very good. Anyways, oh, and it was funny though, Quantec was left off of the 2014 meeting because the person who organized it was asked by Rob. He says, why did you not include us? We kind of started it all off, or some of it. Oh, he says, I didn't know you, I didn't know what you were doing. And I thought, anyways, so hold that date. It's say right at the back end, and then a series of case histories. I'll be canvassing again, but I have probably 2/3 of the ones I need lined up. There are people out there who are prepared to put a talk together. Focus being material that's suitable for geologists to listen to, not a technical exercise about how my IP system is better than yours. It's like, what are we doing to help discovery, solving problems, geological exploration. So it's a day and a half, and MDRU is taking the point on it. They're organizing it. It'll be one of the downtown venues. And this Sean Barker, if you don't know him, you should introduce yourself to him, is very, very keen to see a better linkage between geophysics and geology. That's it.
Oh.
Thank you.
Any questions from the room? I'm so happy you found the illustration I made of the history of BCGS.
Oh, good. All right.
This is that somewhere else.
That wasn't that easy. I don't think it wasn't in my grab bag before I went looking for it. So,
One thing I thought you kind of were a little short on was Stan Ward's contribution at Utah. I mean, he brought together some of the biggest names in geophysics,
Oh.
Jerry Holman,
Yeah.
Bill Wanamaker, Bill Pelton, and many others. And that was a major contribution.
Yeah. No, it's there in the. Oh, Randy's got his hand up. What's the protocol? No, I agree with you. Randy, speak, sir.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep. Yes, sir.
Great. So I've been spending a lot of time with very little to show for it, doing lab measurements. I'm seeing some wonderful things, and I guess I have two questions. The first is the definition of chargeability. Like there's the Newmont standard where it's like from the area under the curve from 430 to 1100 milliseconds. But my feeling is that in the industry, it's very equipment dependent, and every company, even every study, is using a different thing to plot up. So do you have an opinion of what is a useful measure of chargeability? Do you think anybody has actually done a compilation of all the different definitions that are out there? And then Doug Oldenburg has a whole different thing for, theoretical. It's that, that first ratio of the initial drop. So the units are completely different. It's not even in milliseconds. It's in the millivolts per volt.
Well, what I can contribute is I don't know of any systematic effort in that regard, but I have a person I can think of who has a predisposition to looking at problems like that, and that's Christian Dupuy at Laval.
Oh, okay.
He's well, not more, but he's very much inclined to look at the physical acquisition side of data as where he likes to spend his time. And
that's really good news because I'm in correspondence with him for other things.
Okay, it may not be currently on his list, but I think it is. He's actually done some borehole work, and he's been finding it frustrating. So maybe something that was on some sort of surface array. But he certainly, I think, could, on the back of a paper napkin, probably write out these are the 3 or 4 models. That might answer some of your questions.
Okay, because you can't compile different companies' work without actually,
Right.
normalizing the various measures. The second topic, which is really important, is in frequency domain, spectral IP. You get chargeability around 1 hertz related to mineralization, but there's also, it's called electrode polarization, but you also have membrane polarization, which is more around 1,000 hertz. And like Soggy Kang at Doug Oldenburg's lab was looking at some airborne chargeability, or it was airborne EM, but he was working with it in terms of chargeability because they were getting negative resistances.
Oh, the fleet-wide
BCGS.
show story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Okay.
are you going to take a look at that, that really quick chargeability, or is that outside the range of what you're calling induced polarization for this project?
Oh, I mean, I think I would say without expanding through the whole question, it's a legitimate phenomena. You're usually what your task, you've been tasked by somebody who's paying you, or you're, pursuing it because of an academic study, and your professor's directing you. What's the purpose of the mission? In the mineral side of things, we tend to back away from too high of frequencies because of just coupling and annoying things that are often, you may get something, but it's probably not going to be what you're hoping to, either the depth or with the resolution of the problem you're trying to solve. So I think there would be a community that would be quite interested in that. But most of my examples are drawn from the mineral side. And so low base frequencies with lots and lots of current and remote reference monitoring. The idea is that we want to try and get as deep as possible and still have decent or as good a resolution as, to be able to drill something. That's the mission you generally have for a minerals client is like you're doing this survey to find a target or define a target that's already suspected, so that it can be upgraded with additional work, and usually involving drilling. So the 1,000 hertz stuff isn't probably going to serve that all that well unless you had some sort of borehole measurement. And I know Christian's very interested in that aspect, the borehole side of things. So yeah.
Well, Ken, I am just so delighted you've done this survey. It's a
Oh,
real
thank you.
service.
Would make one comment on that. I know, can you hear me, Randy? It's Devin. I remember seeing Andre Visioli's presentation at PDAC last year and talking about how people thought they could naturally try to sort of integrate airborne EM with DCIP, and mentioning that the information you get has different frequency content and you're collecting different information about the IP spectrum. So it's not like both systems are similarly sensitive to the same range of sort of frequency content of that IP effect, and that it led to a lot of challenges. So it's something I just felt like I wanted to.
So yeah, that's to say it's the roundup ends on the Thursday at noon, and that's January 23rd. So the half day is the technology discussion, and the full day on the Friday is the case studies. So yeah, keep grab your barcode. It's up on the MDRU site. So if you want to, as things advance, we'll be getting a list of the talks by the end of the month.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Ken.
Yeah. Thank you. So disengage, stop sharing, and
End the call and
yeah.